Good afternoon, everybody. Here we are for Q&A with the family support team at the St. Louis Arc. And today we're going to do a little dive behind the curtain to talk to you a little bit about how our organization supports people with disabilities by supporting our staff to truly understand the values that guide our work. I've got some amazing folks from our quality and training department here today. You guys, I think you've both been here before, but just in case you haven't, I always start with introductions, and I like people to talk about their journey at the ARC. So if you started in the role you're in now, great. If you've traveled from place to place, then let's hear a little bit about some of your experiences with us. So Georgia, I'll start with you.
So my name is Georgia Cuss. I'll share that my pronouns are she and her if you happen to refer to me later in any conversations. I have been with the ARC since 2015. I started working in our residential services department, which I did while I was finishing up graduate school for social work and public health. I then worked in day services for a number of years, partly in a quality role, and then a little bit in running our day programs as a coordinator for our older adults. And I have been in my current role as Director of Quality Enhancement and Training for about a year and 3 weeks or something like that. So I've been lucky enough to partner with Sue for the past year in that capacity, and very much enjoy it.
Well, congratulations on your anniversary. And thanks for reminding us about pronouns. George is also the co-chair of our DEI committee, Ready. And so that's one of the ways we do show respect for each other is by knowing how people identify and using words that make sense to them. So Sue Shaw, introduce yourself.
All right, I'm Sue Shaw, and my pronouns are she and her as well. I have been with the ARC since right after the pandemic started. So 2020, I believe I started in August. Been in the field for about 34 years, working in both staff training and mostly residential, supporting people in their homes.
All right, well, let's get started. So our topic today is really broad. We all said we could talk about this for hours. So, you guys can shape the conversation out there by asking some questions if we go too far into the weeds about something. But really, this is a quality conversation. How can you know that the services that you're pursuing, that you want for your family member, what are they being driven by? What are the quality indicators? How do we teach our staff? And at the St. Louis Arc, we have 3 values that guide our work: respect, collaboration, and empowerment. And so we're really going to kind of guide our conversation today by talking about those values. So tell me kind of, what do those values mean to you, Georgia, and how does that apply to the work you do?
Absolutely. I think it's a really nice set of values that the ARC has coordinated as part of our lens that we try to apply to everything that we do. They all, I think, play out in different ways, and we're certainly going to talk more about that. But I think the one that I identify with the most naturally is collaboration, because I, as someone who walks through the world getting my energy from other people as an extrovert, I really groove on partnership type work, and that is I think true for so many folks that we support as well, whether extrovert or introvert or otherwise. We really believe that the best way to get somewhere is by actually doing it together. Sue, I think we'll come back to this, but has a couple of really quippy phrases that are helpful to keep this in mind when we're doing the work. One of mine is that I think is part of collaboration and also part of empowerment is do with, not for. When we accompany someone, instead of doing things for them, we are collaborating, we're empowering, and then certainly that is also a lens for how to make sure someone is respected, to make sure their voice is really part of a process. So there are many more specific examples we'll get down into, but I think do with, not for is at the core of how I try to approach these values in the work that we do.
So yeah, I think, with respect, it's figuring out, are somebody's needs met? Are they safe? And then how can we support them in listening big picture to what they're telling us, even if they can't tell us maybe with their words? What do they need? How do we support them? And then working together with them, not for them, but with them. And I guess that's one of my phrases that Georgia was talking about, is not about us without us. There are times that you have to do something without someone, especially if they aren't ready to advocate for themselves. But as much as possible that somebody is there, we're collaborating with them, we're not talking about them. And then helping them to do what they can do as much as possible, and figuring out how we can support that rather than run it.
So I want to talk a little bit about the employee experience, because as you were both talking, it made me think about how we incorporate people who are receiving our services into experiences that our employees are going to have. And I know that just fairly recently, we were able to go back to our protocol that we have people that we support come in for new employee orientation and talk about what their expectations are for our employees. And I know that's just one of many examples. Can you all talk about how you integrate the voices of the people we support into the hiring and recruitment process, into the staff training process, into ongoing planning and problem solving? I'd love to hear a little more about that.
Something that I learned from day one on the job is that certainly if you're working in a front-facing position where you're interacting with folks who receive services, you are going to meet people that you will be supporting before you are hired. And that was true in the residential team. It was true when I transitioned over to day services, both when I was being interviewed and then when I was hosting interviews and hiring new staff. It's a critical part of what we do, and so helpful. And some of what I learned through that from both ends is that feedback from folks we support on potential new hires can look different depending on the individual. It can certainly come from direct verbal or nonverbal communication about whether or not this potential new staff member seems like a good fit. But it can also look like observations from existing and trusted staff members about the interactions of this potential new hire with folks in the program or in the house or whatever it might be. And if we, a nice thing about the ARC is that people who have been here a long time have a good gut sense of if somebody's going to click and somebody's going to approach the work from these values that we have, in a respectful, collaborative, and empowering way or not. And we start to develop a sense of if somebody is able to be trained in that direction, or if it's really just not a good fit philosophically. And we count on the including the body language feedback of the folks we support as well for some of that information, I think. And then on the training side of things, Sue and I really try to incorporate people we support certainly in our orientation processes. We have folks who receive services around the agency come and hang out with new hires over lunch on their first day, and provide some orientation information on what they like to see out of staff in their houses or in any of the programs where they might be connected. And we have some pretty strong goals about incorporating people that receive services as trainers themselves. And we have some of that in the works with a couple folks that are interns at the agency and who are now full-time staff. And then have other goals that we implemented pre-pandemic and are still coming down the pike now that we're finally in a phase where we can readdress some of those pieces.
We also do what's called POMS interviews. So we're looking at program outcome measures. And so a lot of our trainers are also out interviewing the people that we support to see what they like, what they don't like, what things are missing. And then we can pull a lot of those stories back into training and give staff concrete examples of what it looks like to problem solve with somebody or to support somebody so that they're able to see that.
I'm glad you brought up the POMS interviews, because I think sometimes we don't really communicate with people outside of the ARC that a lot of our work is guided by the actual experiences people are having. If they aren't having a quality of life that is satisfactory to them when they're answering questions about if they have enough friends, if they're happy with where they live or where they work, that's data that we use to really change what we're doing. Yeah, I wanted to just add one thing in that I think it's a measure of respect too, to give people the skills to be engaged in those interview processes and those training processes. I remember teaching people back in the dark ages, they would talk about what their most important thing was in a staff. And I can remember working with somebody who really needed to have somebody be able to cook a decent mac and cheese. And so we talked about how they could ask that in an interview to get the right information. And so we just flat out asked them to describe the process of how they would make macaroni and cheese. And I'll tell you what, we learned a whole lot about whether somebody really could do that or not, instead of saying, can you cook? All those things are really good opportunities for us. I want to shift a little bit because we've got some questions about kiddos. And when you think about respect, how do you see that play out for somebody that's 7 instead of 17 or 57? What does that look like, I guess?
At 7 still, that person's the expert in their own life. Yeah, they're going to need help. They're going to need people advocating for them. But as much as we can understand what they want and figure out that communication and what that looks like. And that's not just listening to the words they say, because at 7, they're not going to be able to tell you everything that they want, or even may tell you something that they want, something that they really that's not what they need or they really do want. So it's breaking that down and looking at how can we support this person in a way that really is going to meet their needs, really is going to make sure that they're secure and safe and that they're able to continue to develop that communication. And then start on the goals. Even if we look at it and say, wow, I'm not sure they can do this goal, where do we start? Where's the first step? So I like to think, somebody that young isn't going to be getting their driver's license, but I want to drive. What's the first step? You have to learn to read. And that sounds totally, it's way at a different place than I want to drive. But, what does this person want? I want to be a doctor. Well, that's probably not going to be something that this person's going to be able to do. But what is doctor to them? And what kind of goal can we work with them on so that they can start making progress towards where they do want to go?
That sounds familiar.
Definitely.
I feel like I've heard that in training before.
You probably have, yes.
I do think, Georgia, and maybe I'll ask this for you through the DEI lens, but, I do think there's that push and pull with a 17-year-old where they're trying to really own their own lives at that point. And sometimes maybe you're not going to make the best possible decisions for themselves. What's the balance there between risk and safety and rights? There's a lot going on.
Yeah, as you named, a teenager, it's developmentally appropriate for a teenager with or without disabilities to want to push those boundaries and take risks. And same for kids. I think a way to approach any of it is to think also about what you would be doing to interact with someone who is neurotypical in this age group, and try as best you can, which I think many folks who are parents who work with us are already doing, but to just to do the best you can to mirror those practices and then make adaptations as necessary. But with the teenager example, yeah, I think the term reasonable risk is one that we try to think about, and there are some risks that probably aren't reasonable, like many teenagers are learning how to drive a car, and that's for a neurotypical teenager, that is totally a reasonable risk. There are skill building things that can happen, but for someone with a disability, it may or may not be. But maybe there are other pieces of that are. Maybe there are there's a way to try out public transit, that still allows someone a little bit more independence with a reasonable amount of risk, and some extra monitoring in place as need be to build those skills and let somebody test themselves and pull and stretch, depending on what the example is. It's
funny that we've got into this driving conversation. This makes me think, from the respect lens for me, I also think about how we support our parents to understand the nuances around this. And I do think that families need to think about if they want to be able to retire and be able to take a vacation and not worry about their kids, or have a plan for when they can't take care of them anymore, the more skill building, the more decision making their kids are allowed to make, the better it's going to be for them. But there is that kind of anxiety about being able to do that. So we provide training. Joys in Training is a great opportunity for a parent to really kind of sit with the emotional feelings they have about their child growing up, and what some of those challenges are, and what is their long-term goal, and are the decisions they're making pushing them towards that goal, or are they maybe keeping them from being able to achieve the goal. I will just say, with driving a car, I always coach parents to say, you don't have to be the one to say no, because if they really can't drive the car, they're going to fail the driving test. They're going to not be considered successful in a driving school, or there's like so many steps before they get the keys and get behind the wheel, where someone else can tell them that if they're really not able to do it, they're really not able to do it. And then you can be the coach and the support, not the person that's setting the rules.
Right. And well, and there's so many resources too now out there, Ubers and, other public transportation and other things that we can use. One of the things I think, and Sharon, I know you use this a lot, is charting the life course. So we can really look at somebody and say, what are your goals and how can we get you there? Or what are we missing here? I know I had a young man I was supporting, and he wanted a job. I didn't doubt he wanted a job, but he kept sabotaging every job we helped him get. And we were sitting in a meeting going, what are we going to do? So somebody finally just grabbed a pen and said, what did you like about the jobs you've had and what didn't you like? And basically what it came down to is, I don't want to work at 9 a.m. And every job we had gotten him started at 9 a.m. And we all sat there with our mouths open, because we should have known that a long time before then. But sometimes just sitting around and saying, okay, let's talk about this, and let's lay it out, and let's break it down, and let's role play it, or whatever we need to do, sometimes makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I wish we had more time for, and that I encourage people. How often are you having meaningful conversations? Have you decided to have dinner as a family so that you can talk about meaningful things? Do you sit down for dinner as a group of people that live together with staff support and talk about what's important to you? Because I don't think you get into the nuances about what you want until you're really having that deeper, more meaningful conversation.
We had a young woman who was saying she wanted to get married. And so one of our staff was starting to look at, what does that look like? Who do you want to date? Oh, no, I want the vacation. She just wanted to go on a honeymoon. She just wanted a vacation. So I think sometimes it's that conversation.
Absolutely. Well, and that touches on, this is not what I was going to say a minute ago, but it also touches on one of the topics that I think is so helpful, is the reminder that also some goals that we would deem unrealistic for folks we support can still be realistic. Either A, because what we're interpreting this person actually could achieve, even if we think they couldn't, they could. But also maybe we're interpreting it incorrectly, and so we jump into the conclusion that a goal is unrealistic. So natural, because it comes from a protective space, but I think, and this actually can tie it back into what I was thinking before, but being too protective can sometimes be a barrier in and of itself for someone, by with the driving example, to allow someone to have someone else, some other structure be the entity that says no, instead of us doing that. It removes a little bit of protection that might hurt, but that's okay, because that's A, part of life, B, something that folks without disabilities experience, and C, as Sharon said, gives us a chance to fill a different role, and it is respectful and empowering by allowing this person to build relationships out independently and let those flow the way that they might. And I think, that's a pretty huge thing. Easy to forget, but a pretty huge thing.
Yeah. And that made me think, sometimes I think we think goals are unrealistic because we are only using one tool in our problem solving toolkit. You know, Sue mentioned charting the life course before, and sometimes I think when you think about things using the whole array of resources that could solve your problem, I think about some of the people we support who don't use words to communicate, but who are able to type and write books and chair meetings. And, you know, so many people are able to do things with technology now that we didn't think they could ever do before. You know, handling their money. Well, if you can hold an Apple Watch up to a screen and pay for your groceries, you're able to handle money nowadays. And so there are safeguards that need to be in place. And I think anytime you're exercising your rights, you need to talk about your responsibilities too. Is that something that comes up when you're in training with the staff as far as how they can talk to people about that balance of rights and responsibilities?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the nice indicators that we are doing okay in our training on this topic is that staff who work in our programs will often point to this as their number one reason that they were keeping something in mind. And so I think our recommendations for staff on how to do this include, well, Sue has some pretty good examples during orientation, but we do it at other moments too, about remembering what is, I think putting ourselves in that person's shoes, thinking about if, for instance, I have a dietary restriction, if I have received a diabetic diet diagnosis, does that mean that every person without a disability who has diabetes never eats a bowl of sugar cereal again in their life? Like, of course it doesn't, you know? And so when we put the very direct empathy lens on and imagine ourselves in this position, that I think is our starting point to remember some of the rights and responsibilities pieces. But we also certainly have other agency structures in place to protect folks and their rights. And there certainly is state mandated due process where anytime someone may have a rights restriction in place, that is reviewed to make sure we are not inhibiting someone in a way that we shouldn't, which extends to all kinds of examples, including some pharmacological interventions examples. And I find that staff bring those examples to us more often than not, anytime they suspect that something might be a little funky. And I think their baseline is, does this person seem happy or unhappy that this has been something requested of them? If they are unhappy, let's just check in and see if it's connected to rights or not, which is also a nice just sort of gut check, I think, for how to approach it.
I think that's piece of that makes me think about working with families too, because I think it's that all or nothing approach. I remember when we worked with a family and the daughter had a new GERD diagnosis, and there wasn't a whole lot in the GERD diet that she loved, except ketchup. And so we put it into the plan that ketchup was not off limits for her, because for her, she could work that in at any time. But later on, several years later, I think she might have been living with us residentially, but I remember she had a goal. She loved whiskey, and she was trying to find a mixer for whiskey that didn't cause her to have indigestion. And I thought, now that is a personalized goal. And her mom was fully supportive. She was a grown adult, and she wasn't over drinking, but it was really more about the Sprites and the bubbly club sodas and all that were causing her problems. So shout out to Liz.
Yeah, I know somebody who she really, her medication wasn't conducive to drinking alcohol as well, but she really wanted that 1 beer a day, and she went and talked to her doctor, and the doctor prescribed. It was on her MAR that she got 1 beer a day. So advocacy.
What's a MAR?
Oh, a MAR. So that is the list of medications that person can take. It basically tells you what people take, when they take it. We sign off on every time somebody's given medication so that we know exactly what they've taken, when they've taken it, and the staff then monitor that, make sure other meds are ordered, etc.
Thank you. I
Well,
try not to use that. We get caught in acronym land and then everybody
Thank
gets
you.
mad at
Yes, I
me.
appreciate this.
Call me out if you catch me in there as well, because it happens all the time. Go ahead, Georgia.
just that's a perfect place to put a piece of advocacy, you know, when especially for those of us who are staff supporting someone, if it is all but mandated in someone's medication record that we have to sign off on that this person in fact has the right to a beer, you know, that really can be helpful. And so that finding creative ways to advocate is such a lovely way to approach it also, I think.
Awesome. This conversation's kind of gone all over the place. I appreciate your flexibility with just answering any random question that comes into my head. We've only got a few more minutes, and I know that the two of you talked a little bit about what you wanted to be able to share in this session today. Is there something that's important to you that you'd like to share with our audience about respect, empowerment, collaboration, about quality at the ARC that and it doesn't really even have to be at the ARC. Maybe it's about how they seek out quality wherever they're going. But what would you like to say before we wrap our conversation?
So I think for me, one of the things that I've just really been playing with a lot lately is we have, you know, people we advocate for, we have people that we're allies with. And I think that we use that next word as champion, which is kind of a word that I feel like is separated from the person themselves. And they're not maybe in the middle of that. We're championing somebody else's beliefs or whatever. And so I've been playing a lot, and maybe this isn't quite the right word, but somebody being an accomplice. So they're there with them, they're helping that person, whatever that looks like. That doesn't mean not being safe, but just like you're there, you're in the dirt with them, you're walking through it together. And I think that you know, just making sure we're not divorcing what we're doing and trying to help somebody from them. That it's really important that we're listening to them and we're doing what primarily they want to do, not where we want to take them.
Man, you opened the door back to that language conversation where we started. And now I want to just kind of, all right, we're not going to be able to lean into this too much, but I will say that over the course of time that I've been in this field, how we use words to describe people with disabilities has changed so dramatically. And I think so much now is driven by respect, by what the person wants, just like it's happening with other disenfranchised groups. Now we know some people prefer to be called disabled. Some people want to be called autistic. And so, you know, people first language is still kind of the, if you don't know, you can go that way. But I think also just asking people how they like to be referenced is really important, because some people are very offended if you don't put it out there for them. Georgia.
That's almost exactly my example I was going to share in a great way, because I think yes, I think language evolves over time because so do attitudes. Certainly some of it's research based, and then some of it is because each time we shift language, community stigma starts to affect that terminology. So we evolve again to get away from some of that stigma, and it shifts with us and things like that, but that's okay. And so doing our best to keep up with those things in a supportive fashion without letting it bog us down from doing the actual good work is a great starting point. And then I think people first, person first language versus identity first, I think is that alternative option when you just listen to someone and trust that they know themselves best, is exactly right. We have a resource at the ARC called the Common Language Guide that our DEI group pulled together. So if families are ever interested in just a list of some common terminology that partly applies to the disability community and partly applies to just other identity groups, it can be a helpful starting point to make sure we're have common ground with the language we use when we come together to discuss topics like this. So that's always a fun one to share.
Yeah.
But it's been great to be here today.
Yes, thank you.
Well, hopefully we'll come back. I know as part of my committee within the quality department, we're working on a self-determination guide and working on ways that we can always be really cognizant of how to keep people at the front of decision making in their lives across all the different aspects of their lives. So the work happens in many, many different environments. And I think as we build people's capacity to say what they want and to be really in the front of that, that's how we change all the things that are happening. So so it's nice for me to hear you say that. I know we've taught people first language as sort of a standard in the past, and so we've got to be on top of things and change things as they move forward. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.